Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Claudia Brittenham, Associate Professor of Art History and Interim Director of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Chicago. And today it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the sixth in our GIS in Latin America series. And before going on to introduce our speaker, I just want to mention that if you've missed any of the previous 5 of the events in this series, we have recorded them and put them up on the Center for Latin American Studies webpage. Right now, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Bianca Premo, who is the professor of history at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University. She's a scholar with a wide range of research interests in Latin American history, including childhood and youth, the law, intellectual history, gender, slavery, and ethnohistory. Her most recent book, The Enlightenment on Trial, Ordinary Litigants and Colonialism in the Spanish Empire, is a comparative study that reveals how ordinary, often illiterate litigants made law modern in the courtrooms of the vast regions of the 18th century Spanish Empire. It was published in 2017 and received prizes from the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Association, the Southern Historical Association, and the Rocky Mountain Council on Latin American Studies. Her first book, Children of the Father King, Youth, Authority, and Legal Minority in Colonial Lima, reviews how Lima's children were socialized into colonial hierarchies and how adults viewed and practiced their roles as authority figures over children in a legal culture that favored elite fathers and distant kings. She also co-edited Raising an Empire, a volume of historical scholarship about children and childhood in early modern Spain, Portugal, and colonial Latin America. In addition to numerous articles and book chapters on colonial Peru and Mexico, and early modern Spain in the fields of legal studies, ethnohistory, gender, and family and Atlantic history. Today, she'll speak to us about a really exciting and collaborative project called Domains, the Colonial Spanish America Digital Jurisdictions Project. And her talk is entitled Domains, Mapping Jurisdiction to Understand Spanish Colonialism. Welcome, Bianca, and thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Thanks so much for that introduction. Let me begin by I want to thank Natalie and Diana for arranging the talk today, Claudia for the introduction. And I also want to begin by admitting to being a little bit intimidated because I made use of the recorded webinars from this series. And I really appreciated the very wonderful prior speakers and the depth of their digital humanities or digital social sciences projects. The spatial scholarship not only represents Latin America and the Caribbean in new ways, but it really unveils structures and trends, data that otherwise would remain invisible to us. So I don't want to overdraw a distinction between the production of new data for scholarship and as many of these other projects do, and the representation of new data using visual methods that can enable students and scholars, those who are learning, to grasp trends or patterns differently or better than traditional analog representations can. But in the case of this particular Domains project, I really think the distinction is useful to keep in mind. The utility, I would say now, of the Domains project in this phase of its life cycle and really at its inception is definitely more as a resource for teaching, especially undergraduates, and in its inception for graduate teaching. So I want to talk first a little bit about how the project is used. You know, I'll talk more about its features. They'll kind of be revealed as we go. I can't navigate to it, but I start you here on its landing page, which I have hosted on my personal website, the kind of context that you give to any of these kind of GIS projects. The thing that's nice about having it on this particular website is that I can track who actually goes to the domain site from my personal website and where, you know, sometimes where they're coming from. And there's some interesting things here. From its original inception, when it went live in the spring of 2017, it was at its height of about 400 discrete views in a month. But generally it's anywhere from 10 to 80 viewers a month. And the highs are almost always in the early part of the fall, August, September, October. This tells me that I think its US graduate students, or excuse me, US undergraduate students who are probably accessing this in the chronological sequence of a traditional introduction to Latin America or colonial Latin American course chronologically. I can't always track the country of views for this particular site, but I'm guessing it's mostly US students and faculty assigning it. It'll be interesting to see with the new introduction, which we recently have, of Spanish, the Spanish translation on this site, which is in ARC-GIS, Esri Story Maps. We've just recently added the translation in Spanish, and it'll be interesting to see if this is of interest to Latin American or Spanish-speaking audiences. Since its inception, the use of the site has kind of gone down, predictably, as really dazzling, amazing new projects come up. And also I've done less promotion of it. But it is also very interesting to note that its biggest bump since its very beginning was in fall of 2020. And that, of course, has to do with everyone's scramble to find different kinds of teaching materials that integrate with a remote environment. I also created a 10-minute short teaching video really aimed at undergraduates as part of a teaching collective that I helped germinate. And while the link between the video refers to the site, so I think maybe some curious students came over, which is kind of interesting, or else it was assigned interactively. And I can talk a little bit about how that may come to pass with text in a course. So as you can see, when you really look at it, this is a really small scale project. I should it's got about 8 different tabs. You can't really see here, but there's just 2 more underneath here, and we can navigate to that later, of different levels of jurisdiction in colonial Latin America. It focuses at present on all of the jurisdictions, not all, but many of the jurisdictions that converged in the vice-regal capital city of Lima, Peru. The choice of Lima was really a practical one. It's a place that I know from my own research very well, as did my colleague, Judith Mancia, who was a postdoc and a co-collaborator for the project. But it makes sense because there were, until the late 18th century, only 2 vice-regal capitals in the Spanish Empire, Lima and Mexico City. And these were places that that concentrated institutions and officials of Spanish governance. I don't mean to say that they're representative. They're in fact in many ways not representative, but they were probably the most layered jurisdictionally and competitive jurisdictionally of all sites in the empire. The project also is kind of unique in that there was no master guru who originally, trained themselves in the ins and outs of GIS projects or even digital humanities. It was very collaborative, as I'm going to talk about, and we all learned together. We relied on help of others, but really it was a learning process and a collaborative effort without any real expertise all along the way. So what you're going to be listening to today is the kind of history of this site, where it came out of an intellectual problematic in a graduate classroom, how that translated into something that I think is very useful for undergraduate teaching and maybe for orienting ourselves as scholars. But, and that is very limited, and it's very small, and it's not really data productive in the same way as other sites, but that I think that there's a real space for this. And I hope that those of you who are wondering about how or whether to use GIS in your own projects in the humanities, take away either warnings from this or an invitation from this. All of the discussion that I have about how small the project is or how limited it is should not, I think, be taken as apologies or even caveats. I actually think that the scale can be a real advantage. And I think its humility is really good for those of us who are trying to decide whether or not we want to continue to teach integrate this kind of thing into our own research. So what you can expect from the talk is basically a background and creation section, which is its longest, then a discussion of really the site itself, but also some of the intellectual aspects of the site. And finally, a discussion of the limitations and the future of this particular ARC-GIS Story Maps project. So I'll kind of just leave this this traditional map of the audiencias, the high courts of South America here while I discuss the origins. And the origins of the project were in a graduate seminar that I teach in history at Florida International University, my institutional home. And some of you may know, some of you may not, that FIU is a public R1 in Miami, Florida. It serves over 50,000 students. We graduate the largest number of Latinx or Hispanic, depending on self-designation, students in the country. And we have a very thriving Latin American and Caribbean studies program. And we draw a lot of students from the hemisphere, particularly in history, which has a long, we're a young university, but from our inception, we've had a strong Latin American history program. That means that I have the great privilege to be able to teach a graduate seminar like this and get a lot of students in it who already have an interest in Latin America, oftentimes have linguistic skills. They can use Haitian Creole, they can consult things in Portuguese or in Spanish. This particular course zeroed in on the Spanish Atlantic, though for students' research projects, they could really work more broadly. The graduate course was offered in 2016 and 17. And as a historian, I keep coming back to what it was like in the fall, especially October, November of 2016, which I point out because the story of this project is about the real motivation and hard work ethic of these students who, amidst all of their regular graduate work and amidst all the things happening in the world, signed on to this very extracurricular activity. It came out of the classroom, but it wasn't pegged to it. There was nothing particularly tech savvy about the course. It was based on a broad set of reading that aimed to expose students to essentially to legal studies. The framework for the course really drew together things that would be familiar. I know that anthropology is part of a sponsor of this. So, you know, legal anthropology really has been fundamental in shaping especially ethno-historical approaches to the law in Latin America. So things from the Geertzian tradition, from June Starr and Jane Collier type things. It melded together a lot of recent scholarship since the 2000s on a reinvigoration of interest on what is called legal pluralism and empire. So going back to the work in the 1960s of figures like John Letty Phelan, but up to today, the work of Lauren Benton on law and colonialism, especially pointing to the importance of jurisdiction and territoriality and belonging in the work of Tamar Herzog. And then finally, the last tradition, and the one that generally draws most graduate students, is just the tradition in colonial Latin American history that centers the law often unintentionally because of the uniquely legal bent of the colonial archive in Latin America. So this includes, you know, large fields of study where the law is always either at the margins or at the center. Of course, I center those who are legal historians, but I'm thinking in particular of works on enslaved people and their legal practices. Beginning in the 1940s with, you know, Frank Tannenbaum's comparative assessment of the histories of law and race relations in Latin America and the United States, through the more recent work of people like Ariel de la Fuente and Michelle McKinley. So this is the kind of context for what I was trying to get across. But what's really interesting now as I look back from the Domains project on the class, I had taught the class in several iterations earlier, and the class itself, and you know, I admit this, actually had become more canonical, kind of, I would argue that the readings had become somewhat less cutting edge and less let's say, responsive to our particular moment in each iteration, as my emphasis on imparting the practical skills of doing legal history methods to the students grew. As I saw students go through 2 semesters, having to produce their own legal history based on primary documentation in the spring semester, I had shrunk down to activities that had to do with following particular magistrates through documentation by using online databases from Spain for materials that had reached the highest court there, the Consejo de Indios, or doing paleography exercises, which is always really important for colonial Latin America, or sampling methods. So those things had grown, and I kept kind of trying, stripping away some of the more challenging and recent works. I actually think that the fact that I had lost something of an argument to the class, a thesis for the seminar portion, was a boon, because in a way it opened us up to this particular project. So as we were working through these readings, thinking about how they would connect them to their own projects, there was sometimes something of a disjuncture. And that was because most students that I taught, unsurprisingly, given our own historiographical moment and my own proclivities probably as an instructor, wanted to look at the documents or look at legal history from the bottom up, revealing ordinary people's or legal representatives or even low-level officials' interactions with the law and perceptions of the law. So in our conversation, I wanted to guide them to how to do that, but what we had to illustrate the nuts and bolts of what the law was and what was happening in the documents that they were accessing were these kinds of things, which is first, this traditional kind of almost political map of the viceroyalty that highlights the institutional reach of audiencias or high courts. Or I know it's hard to read the second one, but this is just a basic organizational chart that makes it look like the Spanish king is at the very top, and then we go down. And this isn't, it's not that it's inaccurate, but it's very static. It doesn't really have any space for litigants, petitioners, people who interacted with courts or court officials. Even writers are kind of the people who wrote the pages that made up the courts themselves, and the legal archive are missing from this. And then there's a more on the far right, I would say a better attempt to grasp the interrelatedness of institutions. Here we're focused on councils and authority figures like viceroys, all leading back to the crown in what looks like a kind of corporatist model that might be familiar to historians of the 1930s and 40s, and certainly there were scholars like Phelan who pointed this out. But again, there's nothing really interactive, or there's nothing that's really exactly human. It's all very institutional and abstracted. So this was a source of frustration for me and the students. I wasn't frustrated with the students, but rather kept trying to find ways myself to draw on a chalkboard, and yes, I still had a chalkboard, a dynamic kind of map that would help them crack the code of thinking about the multiple different choices that a litigant or petitioner might have about where to lodge a complaint, to ask for a particular kind of grant of a privilege, where do you go and with whom do you interact? And the idea that individuals had choices, and that their choices in the legal political world was the way that colonial subjects actually did politics in this non-liberal, non-Republican setting. That was something that I really wanted to emphasize, but was really having trouble finding some way to illustrate other than through close reading. So as I continued to try to draw on the chalkboard to talk about these choices of legal subjectivity, it was Adriana Alzate Garcia, who I know is here, and I've put on the spot. All of you veterans from the class and co-creators who are here are going to be a little bit put on the spot, but I remember very clearly that it was Adrian who said, maybe we should try to do a GIS project, right? I think that we can do something with this. He knew more than I did. And he today is the chair of humanities and a professor at the Universidad Autónoma del Occidente in Colombia. So I want to give him a shout out because I recall the very moment, and I recall being overwhelmed but curious about what we could do. All of these students that, many of the students in the class thought about getting involved in the project, and in the end we ended up with kind of a core group. And I want to spend a minute, because it is such a collaborative project, to highlight their role. These are the 4 students from the class who ended up being collaborators. We also drew in colleagues. 2 of my colleagues who were professors who had some experience helped us along the way. Then we ended up with a colleague of mine who's the chair of the department, and 3 postdocs, including Judith and Grace, who were veterans of an earlier iteration of the course, who joined us to create the site. We also, of course, had our institutional help from a GIS center with a change of personnel during the life of the project, and Gail Williams at our library. And in the end, this turned out to be the core group. But I want to point out that most recently, and actually thanks to the honorarium from this very seminar, we have added another collaborator, the translator into Spanish, the current FIU history PhD student, Alfredo Escudero. Finally, I want to talk about someone who came in to help us, maybe consult us, and that's my compañera in all of my endeavors that have to do with especially ethnohistory and law, Yana Yanakakis, who's at Emory University. She came in and gave us some ideas about what we were doing with the website once we had it up and where it could go. Some of those never came to pass. Some of them, like having a Spanish translation, took some time and some interest in the project. But it's also, I also want to bring her up because Yana's got her own website that I wanted to, her own GIS project that I really want to highlight, because I think it shows what's possible, what kind of allele projects exist out there to domains, and what makes domains really scaled down, very, very simple design and aspirations useful in a different way. She has this power of attorney in Oaxaca project that traces indigenous communities in 2 regions, Villalta, which is a primarily Zapotec region, and Tepozcolulo, which was the center of a Mixtec region, different ethnicities. Their designation of individuals as apoderados, powers of attorney, to take their cases to various courts, particularly in Mexico City, to represent their pueblos in their voluminous litigation in the 18th and 19th century. So I know she's in the process of adding the Tepozcolula, the Mixtec data to this set. But as you can see, this is a site that is dynamic. It shows the importance of temporality, especially to ideas of distance and space. And it's a really important iteration of a project, because as Yana explains so well, legal knowledge, what was possible for indigenous litigants or petitioners, was also very much shaped by their geographies, right? It's not even just ideas of distance or the presence of a court spatially, which is important to our project implicitly. Here it also has to do with rugged terrain, right? The actual topographical features that facilitate or obstructed the use of different courts. So that's one kind of allele site that I want to call your attention to. This is a fabulous project. Another one that I don't actually have a screenshot for is a really comprehensive website put up by Austrian researchers, and I'll give you the link a little bit later. It's an ARC-GIS project, de las Indias, it's called. And this is like if you had taken our domains idea, but blew it up to its largest possible level, so that every small pueblo, sometimes river, territory, and also institutional level of jurisdiction or even, I want to call it jurisdiction, but territoriality were represented, you would end up with what this site aspires to do. This is a really big site. They kind of take as their inspiration the 18th century gazetteers, the gazettes that would try to be comprehensive, exhaustive in their representation. Now, as we know, the problem with that is that it's really hard to represent everything in all of its elements. In other words, the act of interpretation is really critical to what we do, and so it's kind of located in its own 18th century milieu of an aspiration at a time to have universal, comprehensive representation. And I think it's a really great site. When I've used it, it's been super interesting. It's not practical, I would say, for student use at the level of the students that I teach, even at the graduate level, because I think there is some knowledge that's presumed in it. And it also is a really big site that I think needs to have a lot of balls in the air to stay online. I couldn't grab a screenshot today because it was down. So this is, one of the things that I want to say about the smaller aspirations and scale of this particular project. So to return to this initial distinction that I drew between the production of new data for scholars and the representation of data for pedagogical methods, or even for kind of a starting point for our own research, I really do think that we fall at the latter in this really hopefully accessible way. So I want to talk a little bit about what it was like. I hope that that's okay, because some of you guys are really, I know, very practiced at this, but I'm imagining that some of you don't even know if you want to try such a thing. So I want to really give you an idea of what it was like for someone like me who still struggles for the basic vocabulary to talk about platforms and landing pages and what the different, whether you want to use CartoDB or you want a base map. All of that is really new to me. Everything I've done is really more instinctual. I've learned it for the purpose of what I wanted to do, and then that was it. I've read digital humanities somewhat broadly, taken some lessons from that, but then discard the rest. So I want to actually walk through what it was like to learn and what the physical challenges, meaning the actual technological and just even to the point of using your hands challenges were with some of this. The first thing I want to say is that Esri Story Map's ARC-GIS really, I don't know if it still does, but in 2016, in my world, had an absolute dominance, not domination. It wasn't the only thing out there, but it was almost like anything that you wanted to do got funneled through this. And it is now in what is called its classic iteration. The hope at that point was that somehow the Esri Story Maps function, which puts, or the part of it that puts all that text on the left-hand side and then the map on the right with the tabs, somehow could solve most of what we wanted to do when we were coming to spatial humanities, wanting to represent complex things. We had several meetings as students in this very room. This was our digital humanities lab, where we were kind of exposed to different possibilities, but all the kind of flow, the current took us to this particular story maps function, really because it didn't seem like there was much other choice. And so we had about 3 sessions where we used the university's computers to try to figure out what we were doing. But the other great functional thing about this, the ARC-GIS stuff, is that it also has a web version that students were able to use, and I was able to use offsite. And that's really important when you're collaborating, I have to say. There was actually a problem, and I'll show you in just a little bit when I go through, in that the web version is not as good as the ones that are desktop version that are proprietary to the university. So that made some elements of this tricky. I want to actually even show you the kind of functionality, like what does it look like when you sign in to make one of these things. So this is just an example. I'm not going to belabor this. You know, I thought about this when I was invited to do it. I thought, well, my technical level is so low, I might just have to give a talk in which I said, then I had to hit save. Then I had to refresh. And so for me, this is a little bit of that, but I think it's important because this is still the most kind of perplexing thing. Once you're inside of your own site, one of the things you'll notice is that you're in from an account and you have access to different things. But these were levels in this map that I had access to. And some of the other creators got in under their own account, and they were making a particular part of the map, which I'll show you. And they still are the only ones who can access that. So this is the kind of main map, but I want to just give you an overview very quickly of what it looks like. So coming in this way, I'm able to see my own drawing of the territorial boundary for the audiencia here, the pin that I dropped in the city of Lima, and I can edit it from there as long as it's mine, right? Here shows you what my options are for adding things to it. And you can add a kind of descriptor, which is like a call out box. And I'll show you one here. And I'll show you at the very end what it looks like when it's all integrated. But this will make it so that this pin has a little story attached to it. But that's not the story maps part of the Esri Story Maps ARC-GIS compound. The map and its tabs are, and I can show you that in just a moment. But these are all only accessible to the person who has been designated to create that level. And this is what I wanted to do, is call your attention to yet another Allele site that I just discovered, which I think is fantastic. Paisajes Coloniales by Santiago Muñoz from the Universidad de los Andes. So this takes a 16th century Colombian pintura and actually uses that kind of call out technology in a way. This is the whole story for this map. In other words, where you go is to zoom in on certain things and look at it. Something worthwhile to look at. This is an alternate. This map uses Jekyll, which is not something I'm familiar with, but this is an alternate to that, very static story maps on the left, on the right. Now, I had pointed out that this was all these little call outs that came into pinpoints on the map proper. There's a whole other way that you have to access the site, which is that way, I just showed you, through a whole other interface, which I still think is kind of clunky, to get to the site where you can edit the story map along the side, add more tabs. So this is what I keep meaning to point out about this for those of you who are not familiar or are so familiar with this that it may be lost what it looks like to somebody who's not. There is two elements, this tabs and stories, and then the map itself. We've just probably by nature, the project ends up having not as much spatial dimension as we thought as we put it together. The story itself begins to grow. It becomes more and more narrative over time. And more we think about the tabs and what's going to go into the tabs, the Spanish translation, and less about what you're seeing in the map proper. So that's just a little technical overview of what it looked like, and some of the, I think you can already hear some of the barriers that we ran up against when we were trying to work together. But it really, in the end, there's a more narrative than visual understanding of jurisdictions that I think that comes out of this map because of the heavy use of text and narrative description. So I actually want to take a moment and just kind of look at this and talk about what I think the intellectual payoff, or what I think is kind of good about this project. And that is that I think that the jurisdiction and trying to map them can help us understand multiple things. As I said before, really it does aim to show us that jurisdiction was a space of politics, legal, relational, interpersonal, as well as spatial. This has a lot to do with the proximity among or between authorities. So if you live in a kind of remote area, you have fewer authorities that you can appeal to, whereas if you live near the center of Lima, you have a wealth of different authorities and institutions. But it's not only based on this kind of question of distance. Borrowing from Lauren Benton, whose work has really been fundamental for a lot of legal scholars of a global legal history and colonialism, the idea is that we want to continually convey the flexible, competitive, messy, as she says, often non-hierarchical nature of legal institutions as the space in which colonial subjects did politics. And there is obviously a hierarchy. You know, you have a ruling at the Council of Indies. It has bearing and preeminence over rulings at lower levels sometimes. But there's something kind of beautiful about these tabs, which I'm sure really bother other folks in this very set format that you can go to. There is a hierarchy here in that we start with the viceroyalty and kind of move to smaller, geographically smaller units. But the fact that they're all tabs actually shows something that I think is important. They were all competitive with each other, and they were made competitive only through interactions with litigants, petitioners, and folks who were caught up in the net of the Inquisition or criminal authorities. So one of the nice things about the Esri Story Maps tabs is that it actually levels what we presume to be hierarchical and makes us argue for hierarchy rather than presume it. It's really important because in colonial Spanish America, many litigants engaged in what was known as forum shopping. They would take a conflict or a request to different authorities, shopping around for the most propitious environment. That also changed the content of the way they were representing themselves and whatever their conflict or request was, because it had to match the reach and power of the official and the institution to which they were appealing. That is something that I really hope to be able to convey here. The other thing is that very strategically, these litigants and these petitioners pit institutions against one another to their advantage through forum shopping or just through the kinds of often very, let's say, inflammatory ways that they would talk about other judges or other institutions in the very city. So there's also another element of this that has to do with thinking outside of Western categories of law. And if I could click here, and I will later, to show Indigenous jurisdiction, I think I might eventually end up moving that tab to be on par here, because recent work, including an article that Yana Yanakakis and I wrote for the American Historical Review, really is emphasizing the importance of Indigenous judges. You know, we tend to separate culture and Indigenous culture from the law in ways that I do not think are particularly productive. We acknowledge that Native judges that were in cabildos or town councils had some jurisdiction over the subjects, the natives who lived in their pueblos, but we don't really think of that necessarily as part of this competition in the larger colonial framework, which generally is portrayed as taking place between church and state, very high level officials, or between different state entities over boundaries, right, over borders. In fact, a lot of the competition that we're talking about was really about the reach of Native authorities in their semi-sovereign grasp and hold over Indigenous pueblos. And I can't emphasize how important it is to elevate Indigenous jurisdiction here, not to deny that Spanish officials were constantly trying to circumscribe and shrink down their authority, especially in the 18th century. But the Indigenous jurisdiction, the alcaldes and the cabildos of these pueblos really were the kind of life force in the Indigenous parts of the empire. These were the mechanisms, these were the places that higher level Spanish judges had to compete and do negotiations with in order to get justice or administration carried out. So we shouldn't think about the Indigenous judges as only a legacy of some pre-Hispanic baseline of something like Indigenous law, nor should we think of the cabildos and the judges that we're talking about who competed over jurisdiction as completely co-opted and operating in a European legal framework. I think it's somewhere in between the two, but this was a sphere of authority that actually was made real through interactions and through objects, both natural objects, boundary stones, actual markers over fields. I mean, everybody was concerned with territoriality, but also human-made objects, such as what the Mixtec people in Tepozcolula, where Yana and I, looked at a particular case, over something called a casa de recibimiento, which was this kind of temporary agricultural shelter that would be put up to conduct legal business, to host a Spanish authority coming through, to house authority, right? There were architectural and environmental elements to the way that jurisdiction was channeled. And it's not only just things on land. A staff of office, this object could have this like numismatic quality and kind of fetishize the law and bring it into existence, exactly the same way that Spanish paper and text that are court cases that our students use in these classrooms will be reading and looking at. So I have a lot more to say about courtrooms, about space in that sense, about whether or not it makes sense to think of those mostly spatially and physically or materially. But for now, I want to say that what this really underscores for us is that jurisdiction or authority really was shaped by the piece of paper and the litigant who lodged their complaint or their request before them in tangible and dynamic ways. So the question was always, which legal subjectivity would a petitioner emphasize? Would they be a sacramental subject before ecclesiastical authorities? Would they present themselves as an Orthodox Catholic before inquisitors? Would they emphasize their rights as property owners before civil authorities, community or individual? Would they represent themselves as miserables, not fully responsible for their actions, or someone who was enacting a fuero, which we can talk about a little bit later, a kind of privilege at law? Let's say that often happened in criminal court. So I'd say along those lines, there's another advantage of domains for teaching colonial Spanish American history, is like a bug that I think we can turn into a feature. And that is that the story maps, by giving us all this space to write and explain, actually reproduces to some extent the written word and its domination in the archive, the very archive that we're accessing, in order to understand the multiple ways that the law was experienced and used. So it reproduces. This is a problem, right? Epistemologically, we're just following the archive. We're reproducing the structures of empire, and some of these maps that are really imperial in conception as we make a map like this. But at a certain level, it actually calls our attention to that, to the elusivity of, or elusiveness, I should say, of unwritten practices of law, of colonial power or social exchange and understanding. And it roots us back to the written word and the logics of Spanish law, as well as the artifacts, the facts they left behind, in order to grasp them. And I think this is the big methodological challenge that we all have when we're trying to look beyond the archive or find counter archives. We're rooted through the archive in order to peel away its layers. And that kind of circular reliance on text, I think, is very, very indicative of the moment we are in historiographically, and also the kind of reliance on text and its magical powers that colonial subjects experienced. So I also wanted just to highlight some of these issues. I want to take you to two places in the story maps, but I also want to take you outside the story maps for a minute to something that, and so later I'll show you objects a little bit and how I try to integrate them here. But I also want to show this kind of final way of using the site that can show how important jurisdiction was to individuals and how it kind of shows up on paper and what we're trying to do to capture that to some degree. And that is this petition of an enslaved woman who was, it's really a kind of very powerful lawsuit that she brought before the ecclesiastical courts based on his fuero as a priest. Her owner was a priest, and he essentially raped her. And implicit in that was a promise of freedom. So there's two different legal mechanisms that could have had her resulting as freed from this violation. She chose to go to the ecclesiastical court, and you can see this is not that unusual, but in a petition, there's always an invocation of the jurisdiction, right? And you can see from what jurisdiction, oftentimes it says right at the beginning here, she's positioning herself within the archbishopric and then therefore before ecclesiastical authorities. Later, and this is the end where she signs with a cross on her page, her legal representative explains something that that Natividad, the enslaved woman who's making the lawsuit, knew. And she says, I could very well lodge my appeal before the señores of the Real Audiencia, where the law of God has directed that slaves demand freedom. What she's saying here is that she understands, and particularly at this moment, that civil authority, royal, not ecclesiastical courts, had come to be the place where most freedom suits were heard. And she also had a purchase on this because this was kind of a sex crime. So it could have been a criminal crime. But she's actually acting as if the statement here puts the power in her hands to decide where this will be tried, and kind of minimizes the priest's own privilege to only be heard in an ecclesiastical court. So this is what I mean by how much of the documents from the legal archive that we have are really about jurisdiction, about people maneuvering to be heard before officials, to prop up some officials, diminish others, in order to carve out their own opportunities in interactions and conflicts with others in colonial society. So I'm going to leave that there and maybe show some other things along the way. But I think that where I was talking about the epistemological limits of kind of being rooted all the way through mediated language, the courts that are kind of created outside of an indigenous setting, outside of the communities of people of African descent in any given city, outside the reality of poor castas who make up the majority of any large colonial space, that we're beholden to these imperial categories of jurisdictions and levels and institutions and even writing, but we also somehow cannot push beyond them. We have to get what we want, which is outside of their purview, through them. Really is one of the lessons I think that a lot of us are learning, and it's kind of a nice way for students to interact with the website. Then I'm going to leave with a couple limits on this website. Some are obvious and some are more esoteric. Obviously, I want to leave aside the glaring omissions. Inquisition was never done. We only did 8 tabs for 8 people. Lots of rural regions are left out. There's no change over time represented, which is, it was just too tricky in this particular platform. Really, the limits, however, that I want to underscore are these intellectual ones. The really most productive use of the site that I've found, and I think, is realized not internally to the site itself. The site doesn't lead you to these outside readings or lectures or even videos. It could, but it doesn't. The map doesn't offer the tools itself to understand all of what I've emphasized. It's just one piece of material of many. In reference to my own scholarship, here is how I've made sense of it. Second, I think this project is probably best understood by those interested in GIS and digital humanities as a cautionary tale about how spatial or geographic thinking or emplacement is key. Indeed, the way jurisdictions looked and could be accessed or accessed depended so much on where they were, and were really specific in many cases, culturally and geographically. There were no casas de recibimiento in Lima, these kind of mobile structures that were put up in the outskirts for land disputes in Tepozcolula, Oaxaca, nor was there a big viceregal court and that kind of pageantry with courtrooms in Tepozcolula. This isn't the same as an abstract process that, however, this kind of this emplacement is not the same as an abstract process of making relations, that become material over time. And it's not the emplacement is not the same as embodiment. So there are other features that are really hard, I think, still to capture with the technology that we have that GIS just kind of can't offer, which is a single person changing their orientation, not just spatially, but when they abstractly think about how they want to root themselves to power, right? That changing of oneself from a sacramental figure to a rights-bearing figure to a miserable, all within the space of thinking about which court official and what kind of people they will be engaging with. So the last limit is really centered on the space where human labor and technology meet. And that is that when we as a group began the project, we all had really big ideas about what we would add, our spaces of our own interest, obviously Colombia, Gloria Lopera, who may be here, really understands indigenous districts in Colombia and could probably create that region and multi-level maps. And these can all be realized, but between 2017 and today, babies were born, dissertations were defended, books published, and the GIS, main GIS person that we were working with left our institution. These are kind of cautionary tales. I also do want to say, though, of those dissertations defended and of the folks that I had as co-collaborators, all of them are off except for one. They will have completed their PhDs by the end of the summer. And most of them have law right at the center of what they're doing. I can kind of see bits of this project, I think, shaping their own thinking. And the final student who's going to graduate, who's here, is Morgan Gray. And she's working on her dissertation now. And she's working on a dissertation that is about sexual assault in Lima and how the jurisdiction that a victim or her family appealed to actually shaped not only the claims that she could make, but also had an emotive impact. The kinds of emotions that both were expressed and then therefore were appropriate were jurisdictional in nature. So you can see a lot of, I think, a lot of emphasis from this this little foray on her work. So obviously, all of the things that were problems, the fact that passwords are now locked and people have moved on, all of that are things that can be worked around. But something that's not so easy to work around is that as our lives went on, ARC-GIS Esri got rid of this classic edition and now has a new, better one. They're committed to keeping the platform that we've used and our sites up. But the program itself is not going to change with the technology. So where we're facing right now is to use outdated technology and continue to grow it, if that really is what its value is, to start over with a newer, either the new ARC-GIS Esri Story Maps and add other places to it or deepen the Lima, or to let the site, which has a life cycle, go through a midlife renaissance now that it's got Spanish access translation on it, and then to let it grow into old age and die a peaceful death. If the latter is its fate, I don't think there will be any regrets, although some of the veterans can tell you what they think. The biggest lesson for me that I've learned is that it is the human element to jurisdictions, the interrelational ones, not the material or environmental, spatial ones necessarily, that really I'm trying to capture. And also that it's the human element of working together to create a project that the kind of transitory nature of human interaction is really what is so precious in having done this, because it's finite. That really matters to me more than the sustainability of the project. So I'll end it there, and I'm delighted to hear any questions you have and explore the site with you if you'd like.
Thank you so much, Bianca, for this really fascinating talk that spans everything from the absolute nuts and bolts of how to conceptualize a project to some of the really high level kinds of questions that emerge from thinking about jurisdiction and legal process within the Spanish Empire. We have a great question that just came in from Ellie Walsh, which is, have you used the site in undergrad classes?
Oh, yeah.
And how might you envision that working?
So that's a good question, and I'm happy to say that some of the things that I showed you are some of the ways that I did it. Now, the last time that I taught a lower division course, it was kind of optional. I think there may have been some questions. In fact, one of the veterans was teaching alongside me as a TA there, or two, our translator too, so if they remember it differently. But I don't believe I made visiting domains a requirement, but it was so, I referred to it so much that I think my students went. And what I did is I triangulated the website, this video, this short video that I had made that talked about jurisdictions and talked about what options an individual litigant. I think at the end I used an example of a woman who would be married to a militia member who could have used this court, or she had a claim against him for having used love magic if he was having an affair, then she would go to the inquisitorial court. And I tried to illustrate it that way. That, I think, inspired students to actually look at what the jurisdictions were, what were the options for the students. But I think maybe the most important thing was actually the translation that my colleagues, Jane Mangan and Nora Jaffrey, put into a reader on women in colonial Latin America, which was Natividad's lawsuit, which came out of my research in the ecclesiastical archives of Lima. And that is just it was a rich and heartbreaking lawsuit, but it had very front and center her own statement about the importance of jurisdictional politics, why it was so critical to her, and how much she, as litigant, together with her lawyer, was deciding on where the proper venue for her case was. That was really, I can't explain enough how much in my learning about legal history, jurisdiction actually has come in to stand in for the shape of colonial power and the possibilities and limits on what ordinary people could do to create space for themselves, to gain legitimacy within colonial power, and to be kind of multidimensional figures in the colonial world. I think it actually is just an absolutely key way of understanding what colonial power is, and maybe does more for us than older, more top-down kinds of discussions of the law as a hegemonic trick that roots everyone's logic right back into European domination, right? I think it elevates in some ways the very, very important intellectual work that ordinary people did every day in terms of thoughts about law and politics. So that's how I integrated it, by having students concretely figure out what this enslaved woman was doing, finding a spot on a map where it was going on, and then answering the question of what else could she have done.
Okay, next is a question from Jeffrey Wallace, who says, GIS doesn't lend itself well to the kind of fuzzy boundaries that were commonplace in the colonial world. Did you run into that issue while building the site? And do you envision a place for things like murky frontiers, shatter zones, or fully independent Indigenous areas in this site's future?
So that's a really great question, because it also feels somewhat like the contrast that we draw. I want to take the fuzzy boundaries idea and the notion that boundaries are fuzzier, farther away from colonial centers like viceregal courts, and challenge it a little bit. Now, obviously, at a certain level, that's true. When you don't have patrolling soldiers on a frontier, right, or committed communities living there, you're going to have fuzzier frontiers. But I actually think we overplay that distinction. The boundaries between jurisdictions inside of cities were highly contested, hotly fought over. In fact, it's really problematic, and I've thought about this over and over again, that every plaza in Latin America juxtaposes the church, right? And then the cabildo, and if you're in a vice-regal capital, and the cabildo, which is the town council with judicial powers, and often with a little jail there. And then you have the vice-regal palace, on the other side. They are literally corner to corner with one another. And that actually created a lot of tension and fuzzy boundaries. I know a case from Trujillo del Peru in the northern part, which was a woman who ran out of her house during a domestic incident, who ran first shoeless, leaving with nothing, into the cabildo, didn't get the response that she wanted, as is often the case in smaller places, recognized that the presiding judge was an ally to her husband, left and ran in the hallway, the alleyway, I should say, with the bishop of Trujillo, who's this kind of enlightened figure who decided to take her case right there in the street. This is highly spatial stuff. In some ways, it would be beautiful to represent that, but it also is a space in which there's so much competition between these authorities that their boundaries are somewhat fuzzy as well.
I have a question from Jane Borges. Okay. Has anyone tried a visualization of the flow of lawsuit appeals, and thinking about the size of this process and how it changes over time?
I'll keep my pretty brief, and that is to say that would be something I'd be super interested in, because the book I wrote, Enlightenment on Trial, really tried to quantify civil court cases. That is a very tricky proposition given the state of the archives that we're dealing with. But not only, I actually found the state of the archives to be the easy part. The skepticism of other historians and scholars that these can be quantifiable is really the biggest impediment to that. Anybody who wants to do that is going to have to spend a tremendous amount of time trying to convince people that the numbers that they generate have any value at all. I believe they do. We could talk about that, but I would love to see that happen. I don't know that there are really clear inventories of incoming suits to a jurisdiction, except for snippets of time. There can sometimes be edicts that say, we really want you to write down the state of every lawsuit that's being heard in your court. But those initiatives do not tend to last for long periods of time. It would nonetheless be massively cool for the small sets that we have that do have a lot, let's say 1,000, 2,000 cases, to do something that shows flow over time and various places that they're coming from. That wasn't this project. That was more about change over time, and my argument that the colonial Latin Americans, I should say, become far more litigious in civil courts from basically 1740 on. You could substantiate that, but the underlying data is no different in terms of the skepticism that people bring to it, whether it's whether it's represented in a GIS map or just written out in a book.
I think that these questions about, what is the available data set and what happens when you make a visualization of that, and what kind of claim that image has and how it represents its data, and then how skeptical people are about evidence. These are all really interesting questions, as is the question of what can one project do, and where does one actually need to conceptualize another project to bring in another set of data. I think maybe one thing that we can take away from this work, well, maybe two things to take away. One is that there is so much left to do, that there are so many rich data sources that can be mined to create various different kinds of GIS-based visualizations, and that those can be quite modest and still be quite impactful. And so that perhaps for those people out there thinking, should you dip a toe in? The answer is you can dip a small toe and have so many people still so grateful for this project, have it leave so many impacts later on. So thank you so much, Bianca, for sharing your work today, and for so generously highlighting the work of others as well. It's been really fabulous to hear both about the nuts and bolts of this project, but then also about the larger intellectual implications of trying to visualize this kind of space. Thank you.